I'm David Canter, and I developed and indeed named the new field of investigative psychology. In 1985, I was approached by police officers from Scotland Yard to help them work on a case where they were trying to find a person who'd committed a series of rapes and murders. And they came to me because of background work I'd had, looking actually at people in buildings that had been on fire and how they'd escaped. So I'd been working with material about what people did in those sorts of emergencies. And because of that, I developed ways of thinking about how people behaved in difficult and challenging situations. And that's in a way what criminals are always doing. So I had some sort of ideas about how to think about criminals. And because of that, they came to me, and I still remember the hairs standing upon the back of my neck when a senior police officer said to me, "Can you help us catch this man before he kills again?" And you don't say, "Well, I'm a bit busy at the moment." I said, "Well, if you can provide me with some sort of support, say a police officer, to help do some of the analysis work that I knew was necessary to do it as a systematic scientific piece of study, then I could be able to do something much more effectively." And they said, "There'll be 2 police officers with you on Monday morning." And those police officers worked with me and helped me to prepare the material that we could analyse and give guidance to the police investigation. And the police said it was very useful, and it helped them to catch this criminal who'd actually killed 3 people and carried out a number of rapes. And because that was so successful, I started thinking about, well, what is it I've done? Because I'd just done it from first principles. I'd not had any real background in police work. And I thought, well, there's a whole discipline here. There's a whole range of issues that are relevant to police investigations that psychologists can contribute. And on the back of that, I began to think about what this area of psychological research would and practice, what that would be. And in fact, I remember I think it was 1991 by then. We'd been through the various work with the police. We actually had a whiteboard, and we were writing up on the whiteboard, what are we going to call this? Should we call it investigational psychology? Should we call it detective psychology? And we decided that investigative psychology was a term that covered the whole range of ways in which psychological science can contribute to investigations. For it to be useful, we had to hook it into what investigations consisted of. So we had to think of that process, that in fact all investigations, whether it's to do with finding new drugs, or it's to dealing with fraud in insurance companies, or things that we've done looking at where improvised explosive devices have been linked for the army to consider. In all investigative processes, you have information that starts off the investigation. You have to make inferences from it, and you have to support those inferences in ways that will enable the decision makers to act on it. What I realized was that to contribute to investigations, you need to have an understanding of what the police do. It's no use just having an academic idea. So I developed an understanding of the stages in which the police go through in order to solve a case. And it starts off with them getting some sort of information, which is often through interviews and trying to make sense of all the material that they have available. So that opening stage is one stage that psychologists actually are very good at, because we spend a lot of time working with all sorts of information and tidying it up and making sense of it and bringing psychological ideas to deal with it. And a very important area is the development of investigative interviewing, both with witnesses and victims and, of course, with suspects. So that's one whole area of investigative psychology. Then from that, they have to derive inferences. They have to say, well, what does this suggest to us about the offender, about the sort of person we're looking for and how we'll find them? I mean, that is often referred to as a sort of offender profiling. I'm very uncomfortable with that term, although I'm often referred to as an offender profiler. But basically, it's about making inferences from all the information you have, including what happens at the crime, and making inferences about the offender that can be useful to the police investigation. But a very important third stage is how they turn those inferences into some sort of decisions that they can make, and how can you support that decision making? And an obvious area is, can you suggest to the police where the offender may be living, because they will have a whole range of possible suspects. But if they can narrow it down to a general location, that will reduce the number of people they have to look at rather closely. And that is one very important area that we've developed, what has become called geographical offender profiling. So those three stages actually act as a cycle of collecting the information, making inferences about it, then supporting the decision making, which might suggest more information to be collected. That cycle is the cycle of a police investigation, but it indicates all the different areas that scientific psychology can contribute to. To me, one of the big problems that psychologists have created for themselves is that they formulate problems in relation to things that other psychologists are interested in. And I've always been concerned that psychologists should study things that non-psychologists are interested in. That's how we connect with the real world. And therefore, developing a way of studying problems that are real world problems that can be of practical value, that is what an investigative psychology is. So it's not only about police investigations, it's relevant to a whole range of different sorts of investigative challenges. To try and put it as simply as possible, forensic psychology deals with individuals going into the legal system, and investigative psychology deals with the whole process of investigation, and often you don't know who the person is. You're trying to work that out. Now, these two overlap. For instance, if somebody is brought in as a suspect, if they have some sort of mental illness, it may be that a clinical psychologist or a forensic psychologist may advise on that. Or it may be that an investigative psychology who understands about these issues will be giving guidance or could give guidance on the interview process. So the two areas overlap. Once the success of my contribution to the police investigation into what became known as the railway rapist had happened, the police were very pleased to say that they were using the latest clever ideas, and they had a professor of psychology helping them. So it became international news. And on the back of that, I was invited to go and talk to the FBI training place in Quantico in America. And I went to see the leading profilers there, and to give some talks to their students and the police officers who were training with them. And I realized then that they had no real systematic scientific background to what they were doing. They were very highly educated individuals. To join the FBI, you've got to have a good degree and some experience in things related to police work. So they're very capable individuals, and they're very alert to all the sort of possibilities of supporting investigations. But they don't really have a systematic basis to what they're doing, or a scientific basis. They certainly didn't in the 1990s when I went to see them. And I realized, because of that what we were doing in Britain was of great significance, because we had the opportunity to develop a research activity that they, in a curious way, didn't have, because they were just a police training activity, and they were hooked into some universities. But in America, there isn't the same centralized opportunity as there is in Britain. So I could go on about that. What people don't realize about the FBI is it was set up to support major investigations around the country, because the average American police force consists of perhaps 20 or 30 people, because there's something like 15,000 or more law enforcement agencies in the United States, all divided up and all very much related to their own locality and to the possibilities for their particular state and so on. And so they don't have the intensity of experience and background support systems often that they have in a place like Britain, where, I mean, in Britain, you know, a very high proportion of the population, perhaps 20% of the population, live within the M25 around London. And so the Metropolitan Police is a huge organisation, 30,000 police officers or something. So they can have dedicated units within that deal with hate crime or deal with any sexual offences or whatever. So they can have that level of sophistication, and giving advice to police officers who really had very limited background, very limited training. I mean, all these things that happen with American police officers shooting people in all sorts of inappropriate circumstances, these guys have very limited training in what they're doing. So it's very easy for them to misread the situation and make all the wrong moves. And the FBI was set up deliberately to try and help with that. So the guidance I sat in on some lectures, the guidance they were giving to these police officers about carrying out investigations were things that British police officers would know as part of their training. So, I mean, that is the problem with the FBI, because of the international Hollywood imagery of the FBI. People think of them as some sort of incredibly sophisticated detectives solving crimes. And these few guys who were in the units developing the idea of offender profiling, they've really sold it as this sort of terribly clever event, and the media's taken it up. Investigative psychology is still a very early development, although it's been going over 20 years now, and it's recognised in the textbooks. There's a chapter on investigative psychology, and of course textbooks on investigative psychology that I've written. It's still opening up as a whole range of activity, and therefore it's becoming increasingly recognised as a professional qualification or a set of skills that are relevant in a number of different areas. But that takes time. I set up the first MSc in environmental psychology over 50 years ago. Only now are they beginning to establish a professionalised section in the British Psychological Society in environmental psychology. So it's taken 50 years. Actually, investigative psychology has developed much, much faster than environmental psychology ever did for all sorts of reasons. So its development as a professional area is definitely on the increase. And because in a master's course, you've also got that forensic element to it that gives you the move towards chartered status, that those career opportunities are coming forward. So you are seeing adverts for investigative psychologists now in a way that you weren't, say, 10 years ago. Investigative processes, all police forces around the world are becoming ever more professional in their orientation. And therefore are beginning to see the benefits of being much more systematic. There is an interesting question of why investigative psychology has started to develop now and taken off so rapidly. And there are a number of answers to that. One is that the police forces around the world are becoming more professional. They are recognizing that they need the sort of skills that enable to conceptualize what a crime is about and how their investigative process should continue. I have to say, it's true, the first time I spoke to police officers about this whole idea of an investigative psychology, one sort of dyed-in-the-wool police officer said to me, "Why do we need all this psychology stuff? We've been investigating crimes for 150 years." And it dawned on me that what he meant was they're still investigating crimes now the way they did 150 years ago. They've got more technology, they've got DNA and fingerprinting, automatic fingerprinting and fiber and stuff, and they can see how to hook that into their standard processes. But what they need to understand is a very different way of approaching the whole process. I mean, after my first contribution to a police investigation, the senior detective involved said, "You know, what we've been doing wrong up to now is we've been collecting evidence, but we should be collecting data." And that was a very sophisticated understanding of the fact that the police have always looked for something that will give them the evidence that they can take into court and get a conviction, rather than understanding the broader process of what they are trying to do as an investigation. So that change in thinking is one area that has made investigative psychology possible. The other is the developments in the sort of technology, the recording of information. I mean, when I first started in the late 1980s, everything we dealt with was really on paper. There were search systems that they could look into their records, but you didn't. When police asked me to give guidance on an investigation, I'd send them a list of the information we needed, and they would fax it through. So we would get it on paper, or we'd get the actual files to look at. And in fact, the first research we did was on murders, was on files, police documents with the photographs of the crime scene and the descriptions from the autopsy and all those sorts of things were in files, which made it very slow and very difficult to work with. And the information they had about where crimes occurred was all over the place. I mean, actually, literally, and in terms of the way they recorded the information. And now they will have GPS information about where a crime occurred and where known offenders are living and so on. So it's much more feasible to do science on all that material, because in the end you need good data to work with, and the data is increasingly getting better all the time. And it's those processes that have made investigative psychology, first of all, possible, and then increasingly essential. I have to say, one of the things I realised very early on about the MSc process, in a year, 12-month process, is you have a very rapid evolution of the field. Because what happens is people do a project, it may be a bit of a mess, but they'll sort something out. Next year, just a year later, somebody comes along, sees that, realises how to do it better, and does a better project. And within 2 or 3 years, you're developing some very successful and skillful research activity. And so I've always argued to the universities that master's courses with a strong research component are a way of motoring the discipline. And the reason investigative psychology has taken off so rapidly and now has a vast literature is because of that rapid evolutionary process in driving the research field forward. So when you try and think about a really successful research project, it's almost the sequence of research that is the really impressive activity. I mean, we started off, the very first study I did of where criminals commit their crimes and how that can help us to understand where they have a base, that became known as geographical offender profiling or geographical profiling. The very first study, we just had a few pieces of information about where burglaries had occurred and where burglars were living, and could see on a sheet of paper that there were some patterns there that we could then analyse. Having done that, we could then go to the police and say, if you give us the information on solved crimes, we can develop much more effective systems. And so various researchers have explored aspects of that, and it's now a whole area in its own right of the study of crime locations and what this might tell us about the offender. So I can think of studies that study how many crimes do you need to give you some useful information about the location of the offender? What about the different patterns in which offenders travel, and can that be revealed through crime locations? How do we take advantage of the increasing sophistication of the recording of crime locations and offender locations, and how do we build systems that actually integrate those two? That whole sequence is really what has been impressive, and so that now geographical profiling, I mean, I'm just working on a book of readings, and we've got studies from all over the world now developing those ideas that started off as one master's project. Many years ago, my wife and I decided to do a book on what it meant to be a professional psychologist. We asked a lot of psychologists across a range of disciplines, educational, occupational, people working in market research, to tell us about what they did as psychologists and what they benefited from in their training. And they all spoke, first of all, about having at least a master's level qualification, because an undergraduate degree doesn't really prepare you for the professional activity. So you need that extra master's level to open the door into a variety of directions of professional activity. But the other thing they said was it was the methodology in psychology, the systematic approach to dealing with issues and understanding how to make sense of data that was the main contribution from their training. Therefore, when I set up the first master's degree in investigative psychology, I made sure we had a very strong methodological component. We got students to collect data and work with it and make sense of it, making sense of what people say, how information is collected, that whole range of skills that really in broad terms can be called research opens up a huge range of career opportunities. As well, if you happen to have been doing research on murderers or burglars or other areas of criminal activity, gives you a lot to talk about in interviews for jobs. And it makes it quite an attractive sort of area to show that you've really dealt with real world issues. And therefore it opens up many different career opportunities. Though it's important to recognise that a one-year intensive MSc course opens the pathways to other career developments, but you usually need something much more to really launch you into the career. And one obvious step forward is into a PhD work, which is usually a minimum of 3 years intensive study around a particular topic. I think the most impressive, successful role that one of my graduates has had was to be in charge of security for the Olympic Games in Athens. She spoke a number of languages and was obviously very capable, but she did tell me that it was the MSc that opened the door to her. Another impressive graduate was one who went to work in the City of London in finance, did a further training in accountancy, and then became an advisor on dealing with fraud and investigations into things in accountancy, and started earning twice of what an academic professor would earn. So that was another interesting one. Quite a few have gone into the Home Office and will be overseeing projects on reducing burglary, say. And there are a few who've actually joined the police and have become senior police officers. Quite a few came in as police officers and moved through the ranks, often getting promoted quite quickly, and then decided they really wanted to be academics. And because they had that qualification, they could jump across to academics. I would like to think the greatest legacy of investigative psychology is opening, first of all, psychologists' eyes to the fact that there is a different way of doing psychology that relates to the real world and to the decisions that people have to cope with. Because there's a huge tendency in psychology to study issues that are of interest to other psychologists, but may not really help to connect with the real world. By studying questions that are of interest to other psychologists, it often makes their theories and ways of thinking about things terribly impoverished and very unrelated to the way people deal with the world. It is changing. Psychology is moving on to be more connected with the real world. But I remember as an undergraduate, we were always had a Viva examination after our degree, and I was asked, this is 1964, I think, I was asked, what is the future of psychology? And I said, to study the person in the street, because psychologists were studying people with mental health problems, they were studying school children. Most of their surveys were of students. They were not connecting with the real world at all. And my studies in environmental psychology, people making sense of cities and so on, and my studies of people caught in emergencies were all things you couldn't take into a laboratory and study. And actually you couldn't even give questionnaires out usefully often to get people's views on matters. You had to get the real material from what people were actually doing and saying and thinking in order to make sense of anything. And I would like to think that that's the major area that investigative psychology is opening up way beyond contributing to police investigations.